Thank you, Eileen, and my pleasure to be here. As Eileen said, I've been spending a lot of time these last 4 years thinking a lot about the ocean's role in controlling climate. So the title is really, I'm not spending as much time talking about the climate crisis with audiences, but I'll kind of give you a high-level overview. Many of these slides I use in public talks. I'm going to one of the COP venues. If heck, South by Southwest, trying to reach people and really give them a sense of what the ocean can do, what it is doing, and how it might be altered to help reduce human suffering and losses due to climate change. And we'll talk a lot about billions of tons, so that's why there's a subtitle there about the billion-ton scale removal we need. To get you through that, I don't really have slide numbers. There's about 30 here if you're counting, but pass forward and CO2 removal. I think we know what we have to do. I'll get to this National Academies of Science and Engineering report that I worked on that looked at several CDR, carbon dioxide removal methods, approaches, and then I'll spend most of the time talking specifically about ocean iron fertilization, but hopefully keep this at a high level. And I'm sure you've got thoughts. Everybody's been thinking about these types of things, particularly the last couple of years. So you've probably also seen versions of this type of slide. This is a classic where you look at time out to 2100. You look at billions of tons of CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalents, and where we're at as a society that uses energy, right? We know most of this, not all of it, comes from fossil fuel, but that and land use changes is allowing us or releasing on order of 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. So that orange line, you can make any prediction you want. It's still going up. We haven't done a very good job of reducing it, but we know how to do that. We could get off of our fossil fuel addiction and bring this curve down, say by mid-century, certainly end of century, drastically. That dark gray area probably never will hit the zero line. There are probably things like long-range flights on 747s, things that are going to require fossil fuel emissions, but we think we can certainly get to 80 or 90% using wind, solar, nuclear, other technologies. What's also become apparent, though, I think 20, 30 years ago, we thought we could get around the climate crisis just by reducing emissions. But as we are experiencing, just open up the newspaper and the floods, the forest fires, things attributed to climate change and disruption, is we have to get rid of the mess that's already there. So we need negative emissions. We need to reduce what's in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide in particular. We're not going to talk about methane, but that's also a contributor. But we also will have these, lasting emissions. So we're going to have to start removing on order. This line here is about 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. We need removal technologies, whether they're land-based or ocean-based. And so we're going to get this, but we know what to do. And we could, by some scenarios, get to net zero by mid-century. Maybe it's going to be 30 years later, but we're going to have to do something, I truly believe. And what we know the least about, we're going to talk about these light blue curve here. What are ways to remove CO2 that's already been emitted, will be part of the lingering emissions in the future. So I do want to show this slide and just trying to get some images in your head. That's how I think anyway. And I think of a billion tons. What's a billion tons? So when I think of carbon, I think of coal, right? And so just to give you a scaling, if you take a coal car, they're about 15 meters, 50 feet long. They hold about 100 tons of carbon equivalent. And so think how long would that train be if you're sitting waiting at a train crossing to carry 1 billion tons of carbon, elemental carbon? Well, if that train were at the equator and could run around the equator of our planet, you would have to circle the equator 4 times. That train would be 4 times the length of the equator. So we really are talking about a tremendous amount of material, carbon dioxide and its equivalent in carbon units that we have to get rid of. So just think of that next time when someone says, what's a billion tons? That's a lot, right? Another way to look at it, so these are just early images, I said we're releasing 38 billion tons of CO2. And so what can we do about it? Well, on land, people have talked about planting trees. So if you take 38 billion tons, and I'm talking about the entire emissions now, and you said, how much could you remove if you planted 100 million trees? You would remove basically 33 minutes of humans' emissions right now. So again, there's a scaling issue, right? We're not talking hundreds of millions. You need trillions of trees to really start making a dent in our annual emissions. The one on the right side, this is Climeworks factory up in Iceland. There's an awful lot being discussed about direct air capture with enough energy and pulling atmospheric carbon dioxide through these towers. You can remove CO2, you can liquefy it, you can inject it in certain places in the ground. In Iceland, they have the geothermal energy to do this. Well, how much have they removed? Well, in their first successful years, this is about a year old, they removed about 4,000 tons of CO2 equivalent and injected that into permanent storage. That's only 3 seconds of our annual emission, right? So think of how many factories you need. Think how much energy you need for direct air capture to really be beneficial. Now, we may use direct air capture, but it's probably not going to be the only thing we can bring to the table. So we're going to talk about the ocean. The ocean, here are some circles that say how much carbon, where does it go? Where does it end up? And I think that's worth understanding when we think of marine CO2 carbon dioxide removal. And the biggest circle here is the deep ocean. The ocean interior holds about 37,000 billion tons, gigatons again, of carbon, mostly in dissolved inorganic carbon, but also some organic carbon. But that's a very large number. And if you look right up to the atmosphere, it's about 50 times more carbon in the deep ocean than in the atmosphere. So if you want to take up additional CO2 of the atmosphere, you have to look at where you're going to put it. On land, that number is 2,500 billion tons. So the ocean here in the deep ocean is still 15 to 20 times more carbon stored there than all of the land plants, all of the soils that are often used when people consider things like soil management, growing trees. And we won't really get into blue carbon, but someone might want to bring it up. Coastal mangroves, salt marshes, seagrasses, they do store carbon per acre quite efficiently, but there's just not a lot of carbon in coastal environments. So you can try and increase these numbers, but it's hard to change our climate. And I'll say that in another way in a couple slides. How does the CO2 get in that ocean? Well, you've probably heard about the solubility pump, so I won't spend much time. But as we increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, with Henry's law, we start pushing that into the ocean. Some of the circulation, deep water formation, can take it deep, where it can remain for, say, 1,000 years or more. Most of it doesn't get that deep and comes back out. But that's what's causing surface ocean acidification primarily. There's also a biological carbon pump. That's more of what I've spent my career studying. That's the uptake through photosynthesis of carbon dioxide into the phytoplankton, the marine plants. They can be consumed or die by zooplankton and move up the food chain. This particular slide came out of a program that was looking at apex predators and their role in vertical migration by zooplankton in moving some of the carbon down. But those particles, that gravitational sinking, when you get down below 500 or 1,000 meters, is the main vector, the main way that you transport the carbon dioxide that's now in the plants through photosynthesis into the deep ocean on longer timescales. We'll get into that. But that's what you would need to do if you were to enhance the biological carbon pump to have an impact on the atmosphere. So you have to go through this chain of food web consumption and sinking particles. So let's think back in those same terms. How much is the ocean removing already for carbon dioxide? Well, that solubility pump, that's accounting for about 25 to 30% of our emissions, so 3.4 months, thankfully. Yes, the oceans are being acidified, but if it weren't, we would have a much more severe climate problem. That blue carbon one I'll get back to. Small reservoir, super important. We need to protect coastal blue carbon, mostly for fisheries reasons, storm management, many reasons, but it's probably not going to make a big dent right now. It stores about a half a gigaton per year, about 5 days worth of our emissions. So let's get into then second part of this talk. How can the oceans remove even more carbon dioxide? That's what I was asked to do at the start of COVID, is join a group of about a dozen of us thinking about this. We were assigned to look at 6 specific ways, and I've kind of circled them in terms of their ability. Bigger circle means they probably have a higher capacity, and the ones in yellow, I personally think have more potential, but we actually finished that report promoting research in all these different areas, from on the right, the engineered solutions, things like changing the alkalinity, the chemistry of the ocean to increase that solubility pump I just talked about, or electrochemically taking CO2 out of seawater and storing it. Direct ocean capture is often called, or changing alkalinity through electrochemical processes. It's a smaller circle here because that takes a lot of energy. We don't have a lot of fossil fuel-free energy. On the left side, more nature-based, and again, people have different definitions. We can restore not just coastal blue carbon, but the open ocean, fisheries, protected areas. Yes, it's good to do, but it's hard to get a large amount, billions of tons of carbon through ecosystem restoration. You can grow plants. Seaweed farming has been done for millennia. It might be hard to scale up into the open ocean, but I think that can be done, and there's some co-benefits. And we're going to talk mostly about nutrient addition, in particular iron. Ocean tubes are here, another way to bring up deep water and its associated nutrients to enhance production and growth on the biological side. But that upwelling that's induced through wave action in most ideas of how you do this brings up deep water where all of that dissolved inorganic carbon is stored. So it kind of defeats the purpose if you're bringing up high DIC water. So it's a little more difficult to figure out. But this is the cover of the report, freely available online, ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. A couple things I want to say before I move on to iron. We need greenhouse gas reductions and CDR to meet the climate goals. And no single carbon dioxide removal approach on land or the ocean will likely be enough. If someone tells you they have the answer, I would leave the room. I just don't think that's possible. They all will have intended impacts. If they didn't, they wouldn't work, and unintended environmental and social impacts. So we have to know what they are if we're going to scale them up. I'm going to talk about monitoring, reporting, verification. That's important. How would you know if you're having the right effect? Field work, I think, is needed in all 6 of these. And I personally don't think that the field studies as proposed in the next decade, say, would cause permanent harm. And I think we have to get going. We need international governance. That will happen under something called the London Dumping Convention, and that will allow for studies. But do realize that cost will determine which move forward. And once we start thinking of cost and markets, we also need to think of the ethical standards we use, who benefits from use of the ocean commons. So we'll get a bit into that as we move along. But 2 more slides. That's right. On this report, people ask me often, well, what about ones 10 that weren't in there? You looked at 6 of them. Well, of the 6, probably some of them at some point will reach a point in time, the x-axis, where we're going to stop. Won't be worth it. Others will need to be scaled up. Other new things will come along. So this isn't the only list. It isn't a complete list. We have other ways to do this. This one I like, though. I'll introduce it early on. This is kind of a hidden in that 300-page report. It was a figure, I guess I had seen it earlier, but it was basically looking at different techniques and where they are in this research over time. You know, how enthusiastic are we? And here's ocean fertilization out here. I think people got very excited. And then it went through a period where people said, well, that's not a great idea, Ken. Why are we thinking about it anymore? And what we had in that report are things, and you see them in the marketplace, ocean alkalinity enhancement, OAE, that are getting a lot of attention. and are moving very rapidly before people, I think, realize all of the things that are needed, consequences that could go wrong. Seaweed's been around longer, but not really thought of as a CDR potential. But watch out what you read, watch out what you think you hear from me and others that, we just don't know the same about all of these. Ocean fertilization, particularly iron, we know the most about. So what do we know? And I'm going to do this very quick, I think. We've had 13 experiments, most of them back in the late 90s, early 2000s. We went to areas, not every area, but we were looking at limitation on plankton growth, the plants, the green stuff, right? Could we enhance their growth in these areas that were high in other nutrients, HNLC, high nutrients, but low in chlorophyll? And indeed, we showed very clearly, this is a Chaetoceros diatom image, we could grow in particular fast-growing diatoms, high iron requirements around the Southern Ocean, equatorial Pacific, subarctic Pacific, and create features here. This is 60 south, scale of 100 kilometers. We'd never done this before, right? This was pretty exciting work, putting iron sulfate behind the fantail of a ship, leaving behind a ring, in this case, of chlorophyll that you could see from space. In that particular case, the US put in 1.3, this is actually not from the US experiment, but in the last US experiment, SOFEX, 1.3 metric tons of iron yielded about 2,000 tons of removal of carbon. Remember, I told you that Iceland, they got about 4,000 tons of CO2 equivalents. So, we were doing this 20 years ago. But what we didn't have time to do, completely successful, looking at productivity limits in the ocean, we really didn't have the technology and motivation, to be honest, to look longer. Where does it go? Sure, we thought about this, but that whole biological carbon pump, it's what's going to take the productivity seeded by iron at the top here, bring it out of the mixed layer where it would only stay for seasons, bring it down into these deeper waters where it can reside for centuries and millennia. And again, this is really important. It's not just additional, it has to be durable if you're going to impact climate. It doesn't have to get buried. We know a lot gets lost along the way, about 90% on average of what carbon that's produced in the surface and sinks out of the euphotic zone where there's sunlight gets consumed by about 1,000 meters. John Martin knew this back 20, 30, actually, well, 40 years ago. But it really differs. It can be 1% or 2%, it can be 50% or more, and that's what we don't know. I also like pointing out that nature does this. The form of iron that's most common in the open ocean, away from rivers and margins, are things like volcanic events or dust. This is just a really interesting example. 2008, Kashitoshi was on the Aleutian Peninsula of Alaska, distributed ash in the top panel. Satellite images showed a lot of color there, more chlorophyll in response to the iron that was part of that. People looked at the solubility, and there happened to be a mooring off in Station Papa off Canada and Alaska, where they saw the pH increase, the PCO2 go down in response to this big bloom. And that was equivalent to 10 million tons, not billions, but certainly millions of tons of carbon in a very short period in August 2008. Another example where I think there's some hope for scaling this is the Australian wildfires over December, January 19 and 20. Huge wildfires, if you remember the news. They're all over Australia. They created, though, these lower maps are on the left side, Australia, New Zealand, maybe the bottom panel is easier to see. They created plumes of ash that went over the ocean, created patches of chlorophyll, that's in the lower panel. And the authors buried in the supplement, really the finding I found most interesting is that, yes, there was a lot of uptake of carbon dioxide. They in fact feel that this offset the emissions, but there was also a lot of export by most models, several 100 million tons in this region. But of course, they didn't set out to study it. We don't have direct evidence as we should, but that was quite interesting. So I want to move on a bit, maybe a little more quickly into monitoring, reporting, verification. There was a Bloomberg article, the three most important letters in CDR are MRV. Well, basically, most people, especially a couple of years ago, were talking about additionality, durability, and leakage in terms of carbon. This little plot is trying to give you a sense when we were looking within iron that we needed to know the durability, the x-axis. And we looked at the 100-year time point as being kind of a good cutoff for when it might make a difference on, human time scales, and how much carbon we remove would be something else, a different measurement. And so those two would intersect somewhere that we call the centennial ton. That's really important, durability, additionality. The other thing our group did is we put this small letter E in front of MRV, because people really weren't specifically talking about what we were studied before, ecological environmental impacts, in this case of iron, which species are growing, and the plot on the right, nitrous oxide, are we producing other things when that carbon breaks down that could offset the effects. So I'm going to spend 3 or 4 slides talking about MRV. It's quite important. I think people have a understanding this. These plots are really kind of eye candy. I'm not going to go into anything in detail, but it's showing you that in the oceans, the challenge might be, in this case, if you introduced your iron at a point source, you would have to be taking multiple measurements downstream. Well, we know how to do that. This was one example of a talk given by Dennis McGillicuddy. We put a bunch of sediment trap arrays and he dropped in Argo floats and had glider lines. And between all of these, you would be looking for, with latitude, the lower plot, the additional carbon, the export flux, that could be attributed to this plume. And you would do that in 3 or 4 dimensions to look at the difference in the local baseline using ships, autonomous vehicles, remote sensing, and models for both planning this, assimilating that data. So additionality is important. You've got to be able to see above some baseline additional carbon. In our iron experiments of the past, we typically had in and out single locations. We can do better than that. Durability, I like this plot. It's from Dave Siegel's recent work. It's showing time scale on the bottom in years. Sorry, that got cut off. Those are years, those colors. 500 are the blues, getting up to thousands in oranges and yellows, 2,000 of the green colors. But if you take water to a depth in the ocean, that cartoon I showed you, how long would it stay there? How deep would we have to go, in this case, to get to 100 years, our centennial ton? And so this shows you in some places, it's really not that deep. It's 500 meters. Other places like the Atlantic, it's a couple thousand meters. So that's important to know if you are removing additional carbon, in our case, due to ocean iron fertilization, how deep would it have to go to have that time scale, to have that impact on climate? Another thing, a challenge for iron is how would you measure and predict that carbon flux and attenuation? I'm not going to a whole talk on sediment traps or thorium or oxygen budgets, but there are ways to do that. But it's not just carbon we need to be tracking on this depth scale. It'll be other elements that go along with it, right? Nitrogen, phosphate, silicon, iron itself, because as they get brought down and returned to the surface, they'll stimulate productivity back at the surface or affect things downstream that we're going to get into slide after this. I also want to talk about this word leakage, and for a couple of things, seaweed, but also for iron fertilization. The left is just a map from, I believe it was series, could have been seeds. Maybe Pete Sedgwick will know here, but this is just a map of dissolved inorganic carbon, and the hot colors are where we drew down dissolved inorganic carbon by growing plants, phytoplankton. But Bach et al. In 2023 really reminded us, and I think we kind of knew this, but okay, you can draw down DIC, but does that bucket, I like thinking of this bucket analogy, does the atmospheric CO2 re-equilibrate? How long does that take? And that is months, actually. And so depending upon where you do this, I don't really like these maps. It might be hard to see, but the continents are in white, the ocean's in pink. And this is a deployment of an MRV technology. And he's looking at the Atlantic and the depth of which it would reach after 1 year, and saying you really don't get re-equilibration beyond even 50, 60%. in this part of the Atlantic, equatorial regions where the effects are confined much shallower, you can get 90–95%. So it's an issue. It's sort of like how much carbon gets deep in the ocean, not all of it. Not all of the DIC, the deficit you create, gets refilled before that water subducts and is no longer in contact with the atmosphere. So that's something to keep in mind. We're going to have to measure what gets deep, leakage, and then we're going to have to measure this EMRV term. I think that's, again, crucially important. It occurs with any marine CDR, whether it's abiotic or biotic. And so that means things that are changing ecology. This cartoon was something we did 30 years ago anyway once. Is it going to be positive? We're going to have fisheries enhancement. Some people will tell you to this day that they know that will happen. I don't think we do. Some people will tell you you're going to get harmful algal blooms, HABs. We certainly grew diatoms. We grew pseudonychia, that types of diatoms that produce domoic acid that can, along our coast, produce HABs, but we did not create HABs during those experiments. The amount of domoic acid per cell was no higher in those sites than in other areas. But we can look for that, and we should. Is enhancing diatoms good or bad? I think if there's a group out there thinking if we really want to restore whales, we have to have more diatoms, therefore more krill in the Southern Ocean, therefore more whales. And you affect, of course, optical properties and other things. It's a challenge to predict these in models, and it's more challenging, I think, to measure than carbon. In addition to ecological changes, we're looking at things like nutrients, oxygen, dimethyl sulfide, what's happening at the surface when we're changing, enhancing productivity. We're looking below the biological carbon pump. I showed you a plot of nitrous oxide, but changes in oxygen, methane pH on seafloor. Basically, those effects need to be small relative to what we would consider positive changes by reducing CO2. And so far, all the measurements, nitrous oxide, more potent greenhouse gases, are small effects in those 13 experiments. We do have to think of something called nutrient robbing. Sounds like a really bad word, right? The most recent paper, I think, addressing this directly, Tagliabue, has something where he looked out at the end of the century at 2100, the year 2100. If we were to fertilize the entire Southern Ocean, we were going to decrease some of the coastal productivity off of Peru. The idea is that that water would have less nitrogen, say, phosphorus, after it was stripped because of the added iron. It's about a 5% difference in biomass after 70 years off of Peru. The thing that wasn't talked a lot about in that paper, there was a removal of 200 gigatons of atmospheric CO2, 50 gigatons of carbon. And so you really have to come to this word, I put it in quotes, a 5% change in biomass relative to removing 50 billion tons. We might decide that that's worth it. But I think it's a trade-off. So we're not really, yes, we can call it robbing. We're shifting where productivity would happen, but this is a very small shift, and we're going to reduce it 15% by just heating up this planet, increase acidification, increase stratification. So that's where models will come in. And how would we assess it? Just for so many people out there might be using the latest and greatest technologies. We really need things from satellites, the camera system, the floats, the traps, the new gliders. Everything is out there right now, pretty poised, I think, to make a big impact on this. I think I'm just going to keep moving here, going maybe a little fast, but I think that was just an idea that we've got ways to do this. This is more philosophical maybe, but who's responsible? Companies are lining up. Venture capital is flowing in by the hundreds of millions of dollars to companies. Well, how are they regulated? I've sat at meetings where companies will say, well, I'm just in charge of MRV, or I'm starting a company just to do carbon accounting. So far, we're not seeing that regulation or that discussion around paying for and being responsible for environmental, ecological MRV. So somehow that's going to have to be worked into the markets or governments that regulate this. Governance, I think it's really important that we differentiate right now between what do we need to put an experiment in the field versus deployments at scale. They're two vastly different things. There's nothing, as I said earlier, that we're planning that would go out and alter the ocean in ways that are irreversible or so large that we would affect humanity and mankind, humankind, the way we are with climate change. And I think the other point is we're seeing things come up about, well, let's just do this in the coastline. We can control it if it's in our EEZ. Some of the programs being funded are restricted to coastal waters. Well, at least for ocean iron, we need to be in the high seas, 65+% of our oceans. And everything we do in the coastal environment going to move offshore or downstream, affect the next country, the next community downstream. So if the ocean moves, we're going to have to deal with that. And public acceptance, I think 20, 30 years ago when we were doing ocean iron, we really ignored the public. We wrote NSF proposals, we got funded, but that pushback really shut that work down. And while carbon MRV might be essential to the markets, it's the EMRV that's going to really be what the public care a lot about. So getting back to summarize a bit about iron, why is it on the list? Again, I told someone I really didn't want to be on this committee and look at these 6 methods. I thought they all had problems, and iron does, but it can scale. In several reports, not just ours, that number comes to something less than greater than 4 billion tons, gigatons of CO2 per year, just looking at high nutrient areas. Some people think we could fertilize low nutrient areas and stimulate nitrogen fixation, so getting nitrogen out of the atmosphere. That would be a game changer, could double those numbers. One reason it's on the table for so long, I didn't really talk about yet, but for the enzyme activities, these plants, they don't need very much iron at all. We put in our 1,000 tons, we got multiple 1,000 tons of carbon in these really inefficient field experiments. 90+% of the iron, added iron sulfate, would precipitate or get lost before it got into the cells. Nature, I showed you those pictures of the volcanic eruptions, things, that number is 1 to 100,000. So a little iron goes a long way. None of the other techniques really have that going for them. If you're thinking alkalinity enhancement, that number is more 1 ton rock ground up, put in the ocean to increase alkalinity versus 1 ton of carbon CO2 removed. So it really is a benefit for using something that is needed in a very small quantity. That's why it's always going to be there, whether you like it or not. The cost will always be lower because of that. Iron, as you probably realize, is a very abundant mineral. To get to these gigaton scales, we don't have to change global iron mining operations by more than 1% or 2%. So it's nature-based, the energy is from sunlight. We're not building structures. And we do have some experience more than others. 13 field experiments. I didn't go over the 500,000-year record of glacial interglacial controls. That's what we were looking at back in the day. What causes the natural variability? Not all of it, perhaps due to iron, but we've had these regular cycles that are tied to the addition of iron to the ocean, reduction of CO2. And we had our 1-month example in SOFEX when we removed 4,000 tons CO2 equivalent. I do want to put out some caution out there. This is maybe a bit old, these couple of slides, but in 2002, there was a company called Planktos. They would Photoshop pictures like this. This happens to be a little bit of trivia here. Neil Young's sailing boat off Hawaii, and Wes George was the character who Photoshopped, got to go use that boat and convince him that if he just put some iron, he could save the world, save the ocean. Well, nothing like that ever happened, but he did make some money. In part, by 2012, they were selling for few $millions to people off Haida Gwaii in British Columbia, native people, that they could enhance the production of salmon if they would just be given $3 million. Well, somewhere in this period, and we keep saying this, it's really premature to be selling these carbon offsets. We really don't understand scientifically the risks and benefits. So at your peril, you can buy a certificate, you can offset your flight, but we need to be addressing this from a scientific perspective. And that's what this group exodus, this last part of the talk. What can we do about it? Well, after that report came out, a group of us got together internationally, a bunch of institutions and countries. We're not for profit. We're a virtual program. We're trying to find partners to do this type of research and talk to the public and reach out for private funding. Some of the things we've done, we've been in existence since early 2021. Anyone's welcome if you go to oceaniron.org, monthly Zooms. We talk about durability, scaling, impacts, cost, the standards. All of that's happening. We're producing internal reports, had a couple of in-person meetings at Moss Landing and at Woods Hall. I circled in red here, just a week plus ago, came up with a new peer-reviewed paper in Frontiers. I think this is a good place to go if you want to learn more about what we're thinking is needed next, the next steps. Field studies are high on our list. These are going to cost us tens of millions of dollars. We're looking now for private and potentially federal agencies coming to the plate. We need better regional, global, and models for field studies. We need what I lovingly call the bake-off. We need to know what's the best form of iron to put in it. It ranges out there. It can be rice husk coated in iron. That's what the Indians are doing, taking a waste product, making something that could float, stick around longer than iron sulfate. And there's people in the US national labs and elsewhere making nano-engineered particles. Yes, it costs more to engineer a colloidal form of iron, but if it's more bioavailable, it might very well be worth it. We do need better technology for MRV. The DOE program, ARPA-E, is funding some of that right now. And we need to keep the social scientists talking to them, bringing them along, getting the public involved in discussions. What are their concerns? How would that lead to governance of experiments and eventual deployment? This is, I think, the second to the last. I'm getting close to the end here because I want to leave time for discussion. But one of the first things our group did is, with Margaret Linen's help, director at Scripps, has set out what the guiding principles would be, because you don't see a lot of this. There's more happening now. The Aspen Institute, AGU, has done this, but let's set out, if we're going to be messing with the ocean commons, what is our motivation? As scientists, it's for the benefit of humans and the environment. We're not out to make a quick buck. I think that's important to at least state under the research stage. If someone eventually makes money on this, we're probably going to need commercialization to scale it. But right now, I don't think we're there. Who's responsible? That was some of this. We can talk about the London protocols and London Convention more if we want to. We have to commit to open research. Not all companies follow that model. Scientists, we do that all the time. We have to perform iterative, open assessments, things that people could join in on, even if they're not part of the team. Yes, that's how we do our work. And we have to encourage the public, I think there's a word or two missing, but to be involved in these discussions. They're not approving or disapproving per se, but we can't wait until after we've moved ahead to involve the public in discussions of what we're planning to do. So yeah, I am at the end here. I think I've gone on long enough. Certainly a fodder, but I love ending on this slide, right? How many times you get to quote the Dalai Lama in a science talk? Very few times, and I don't bring this slide out a lot, but in 2012, kind of at the height of some of the controversy from people saying, shut this down. We know enough already. We shouldn't be using the ocean. The Dalai Lama showed up at MIT, very august group of scientists, engineers. And when he was asked specifically about CDR and the oceans, I love this quote, it's our responsibility to look. So there might be a lot of reasons why you think we shouldn't be doing this, giving motivation to fossil fuel companies. We're hiding our true motivations. But I think, to me anyway, this sums up why I'm doing this. I think it's our responsibility as ocean scientists to look any way we can at any one of these climate solutions. So with that, I can bring slides up later. Would like to get an idea of who's here and welcome questions from this group.
Hey, well, thank you. Very thought-provoking seminar, and I'm sure people must have questions, so I'll open it up for people who may have a question. I'll start with, I'm curious as to how you go back to some of these agencies and governments and such and convince them to put, several $1 million into a research program. I mean, an answer would be we've already done that. So what would you say to the NSF of any country that has the federal agencies or a DOE or someone like that?
I mean, what we've shown in the case of iron is that adding a small amount of iron enhances, say, diatom growth, phytoplankton growth. The whole point, what limits productivity? What we haven't done at all in any rigorous sense is look at, well, what happens to that carbon? How much gets recycled at the surface? What are some of the knock-on effects, other gases that might be produced for changes in ecosystems? And so what that left open, I think that's why bad things happened in 2012 when we went off Haida Gwaii to do this, is, we didn't have any way to regulate when this shouldn't happen. We didn't have any way to assess. People can go out there and claim, I'm going to generate millions of tons of extra salmon for this Canadian community and sequester hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2. And so we've really got to get further in those questions. Where that's coming from in terms of some specifics on government, oceans came a little bit later. There was an Academy's report 2 years earlier on land-based CDR, and that led to Department of Energy investing right now over $1.4 billion with a B in 2 direct air capture plants demonstration projects. So, I think the governments see the need to do something. I see they're giving lip service maybe more than anything to reducing emissions, but I think it's, I'll call it a bipartisan issue. People on both sides think that we should at least be thinking about cleaning up the mess we have as we move, in my opinion, to reduce emissions at the same time. But I think the value is out there and governments are recognizing that.
And Dick, yes, please.
Yeah, so Ken, was a great talk. Thank you. And you raised a really important point at the end about the fate of all this carbon. So what if only 1% of the carbon sinks into the deep ocean, or 10%? How much carbon has to sink in order for this to still be viable on the scales you're talking about with the small amounts of iron and the advantage that provides?
Most of those estimates, the kind of less than 1 to more than 4 billion tons per year, use a Martin curve where 90% is lost, only 10% gets down. I have, from my work, when you create a diatom bloom, that number is often much higher. So you're getting to 30 or 40%, particularly if the depth you have to get to is 500 meters in the Northwest Pacific, where we're thinking of doing some work. I'm sorry, Northeast. It also works in the Northwest. But so I think that number, and given the fact that it's so relatively inexpensive to put in iron, even if you had 10% or 2%, you might be able to go ahead and do it if the other effects were not negative, if you didn't produce other greenhouse gases. So I think, low efficiency, really it'd be nice to get better than that. Some people in our group think we can add in these nano particles and create much more efficient blooms. Another group wants to put clay in. Mokul Sharma from Dartmouth University, adding in clay. It's sort of like flocculants in a wastewater treatment and really get that carbon to sink. Whether that can be done, that scales not as easily as iron. You have to put in a lot of mineral to get something to flock out. But there are definitely people thinking about that. And that's the type of efficiency we need to know. Would we consistently get 40% if we grew a system that bloom and bust for diatoms? If the diatoms grow so fast that they run out of silica, if they sank before being eaten, that actually carries more carbon than if they go through the food web, several layers, and that releases carbon back into the system before it sinks out. So yeah, some good questions out there that we would need to address. And they would have to be predictable in some way and measurable to really move forward as a climate mitigation tool, I guess.
Yeah, I have a question also about exactly this. Of the 1.3 tons of iron, the two that removed 2,000 tons of carbon, was that essentially the primary production, not the export, right? That was not a
No.
sediment trap estimate.
That was my thorium-based export number, I think 150 meters.
Okay.
So
So
not
it
all of
was
that.
actually okay.
Yeah. And one thing I didn't do to this group, didn't say, you know, carbon and CO2, we use CO2 mostly in the air. Carbon times 3.8 in terms of mass equals CO2. So the
Right.
2,000 tons of carbon, 8,000 tons equivalent of CO2. I figure half of that probably got durably stored if it was diatoms, maybe not, but that's 4,000 is about the number they used in Iceland to justify this huge investment in direct air capture, is removing a few thousand tons of carbon dioxide. That's
because you have I mean, of the 13 or plus iron experiments, how many? I mean, I know all the numbers, so you have the most up-to-date knowledge on that. How many of these experiments actually resulted in a net carbon flux? I mean, meaning that it was buried.
Right.
Because I remember the statistics that only about 50% actually you found that there is a significant diatom. And I mean, it depends on the region, of course. But I mean, what's your newest assessment of that?
Well, the data haven't changed. It's just the way we look at it. There were only about 3 that really had maybe it's 4 hard data that could show higher flux in versus out. Deeper, that got to the last German experiment. Richard Lampert had traps at 600 plus meters where he saw a flux in the Southern Ocean in an eddy. So what was happening is we would go there and my group would be poised to measure export. They just kept adding iron. I don't know, everybody seemed to want to get the most chlorophyll. That was our goal. So we never were there long enough with traps or thorium to really see the sinking and the end of these demise of the blooms in most cases. So I would attribute it to that. If you look at
Okay, so it's not that it didn't work. It's just that you had no way to know whether how much really it affected the export flux.
Yeah, we had no direct observations.
Yeah.
And we had the Martin curve and said, well,
Yeah. Okay.
we know it can be a lot, we know it can be a little. The one that they saw in the Southern Ocean, the eddy, was a pretty high number. They saw a diatom dump in those traps. Craig, you
Okay.
want
Yeah. So related to that, and when you say the Martin curve, it makes me think of the Vertex program that I was the first PhD out of. Anyway, but I would argue that you indeed you didn't run them long enough, but in fact what you really needed to get was a good salp bloom, or big take the bus to the deep ocean with the poops. And so how do you do that? I mean, how do you're getting diatoms, or you're actually getting smaller cells, but I think you need grazers and to send the big buses down to the deep sea.
That's funny. Was it U.S. Gieskes was the first person I know who said buses.
Yeah, that's
Take the
right.
bus.
Yeah, no, it's and then
Took the
David's
same
here,
class.
and we took. Yeah, that's right. I took it a few years before you, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's a good point. And
Sorry.
salps on one of the slides, and I used it at COP, it says salp poop. And
I
thought
saw
that was
that.
great.
Yeah.
And so if we could control, or we knew areas that were more efficient, you might target those, right? You might say these are places, but I still think of the North Atlantic bloom where it's primarily diatom bloom and bust that create a lot of green stuff on the bottom of the Atlantic that might work as efficiently or more efficient in terms of the biological carbon pump. And if you can get the phytoplankton to sink before they're eaten, that works pretty well in terms of carrying a lot of carbon, maybe not as fast sinking as a diatom pellet, but certainly aggregates of diatoms can reach the bottom and still be green, so it's getting there fast without going through the gut of an animal. So I don't know, I think it's an interesting challenge where we use really loosely when we're thinking of another next generation experiment. 10 times bigger, 10 times longer. You can see I've been talking to foundations a lot, but it's going to be, instead of 1 month, it might be 10 months, right? Before, during, and after. Really look at entire seasons and the ending of these. And then larger, we were putting in 1 ton of iron. We probably want to put in 10 or 100 tons, get up to a scale. If you can create larger blooms, when they're too small, you get a lot of very quick dilution and then nothing aggregates. A lot of the aggregation process in diatom themselves. So when they get sticky and coated in tep and they start interacting with each other and sinking, and the scale in terms of the size will matter. Duration, of course, will matter to capture this late bloom response. So we're thinking of things that instead of being 10 by 10 might be 100 by 100 kilometers, still large by some standards, but for the ocean, a tiny fraction of real estate that you might go to. And we are thinking that practically, the Southern Ocean is where most of the excess nutrients are in this ocean, but it's a hard place to work. And so to build up, there's still a lot of pressure coming out of these years of why even do this? Are we going to cause harm? We'd go to someplace that's relatively easy. We know when we add iron in the area of Station Papa in the Northeast Pacific, we can generate blooms, and that bloom started to sink day 28 before Boyd and the Canadians and Japanese left. So the water stays relatively intact. The equatorial idea, I like tropical places, but equatorial currents move things pretty quickly. So your 100 by 100 kilometer patch quickly becomes huge. So if we're thinking of the assets we would need, and it's $20-30 million to run the first experiment anyway. If you were to buy new, a dozen gliders, 10 floats, couple of ships, get teams out there for 40 plus days of observations, it's not inexpensive. But again, I always look at that cost is so little compared to what we're putting into 2 direct air capture plants right now, that to take huge amounts of energy and will not be difficult to scale that alone. I'm not going to say don't do it, but right now on the Fed side, it's Department of Energy and NOAA are signing agreements to move forward on the federal funding. NSF is on the edges. They were part of NOAA NOP's announcement a year plus ago of funding about a dozen projects ranging from models to alkalinity. I think most of the investment's been in alkalinity and seaweed, and philanthropic investment's been there as well. Most of the investment in that, I like to say, next shiny object, ocean alkalinity, is, it seems simple. If we change carbonate chemistry, we can get more soluble CO2 in the ocean, but it does suffer from how little we know about how you would do that. Grinding up mineral is not putting in reagent. There's lots of other trace metals and things that come with that. So, and just opposition here at Woods Hole, Adam Schubosh is leading one of those foundation supported proposals, and he put in his permit through the EPA, and they've officially postponed 1 year because of pushback from local fishermen who said you're going to kill the ocean off of Cape Cod by putting lye, sodium hydroxide in the ocean on a scale that you can probably hardly measure the pH change in the 1,000 gallons that they were going to put in. But, it's a lot of pushback. So finding places that are easy to work and bringing the public along will probably be as important as the science that gets done.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Ken? We're almost to time here, so that's just fascinating, and I'll look forward to, I'm sure we all will, to seeing if any of these actually become reality. And at least in terms of research programs that are actually now designed to do what needs to be done to get the information to actually look at the feasibility of these approaches. So that would be interesting to see that.
If I can have my plea to this group and others, we're so good. I've done this in my career. You take pot shots, you sit in a circle and you shoot inward at each other, and mine's bigger, mine's better. I did learn in that academy's process late, maybe I understood it earlier, but if someone wants to try this with seaweed, all the more to them. They'll have different challenges. Someone wants to do alkalinity, all the more to them. I think we should support each other. I don't think it's taking away resources from what we do well as oceanographers. This is adding to. Funds are coming in to do some really good science, build up all these cool tools that I then turn around and use on my geotraces proposal or whatever. I think there's just a lot of win-win here. And when we start saying, no, we don't know what's going to happen, and you're diverting attention from the real basic core mission of oceanography, I think that just is hurting us. And I think that's what I've reached at this point. My regret is having not done anything for 15, 20 years on this. And then society came back, said, what about this? And we dropped the ball. And the other counter is the commercial groups. They're not going to drop the ball. A good number to keep in mind is, 1 billion tons. I said how many coal cars it was, but 1 billion times $100 a ton is $100 billion. That's a massive economic incentive if this were to be commercialized, if there were carbon taxes that paid for it. I think so. Commercialization is with us already, which is voluntary markets and big investments. But let's get ahead of this as scientists and try and bring our knowledge to bear on these kind of questions.